Story. Equiano was born in Africa in 1745, and I would describe his family as pretty good, pretty normal. But when he was 11, he and his sister were kidnapped by slave traders. And unfortunately, he did not remain with his sister because, as you know, families were destroyed and often separated from one another during slavery. He's taken to the West Indies at first. He changes masters a lot. But in the end, his permanent place was England. That's also where he died in 1797. Biography really takes you on an almost, uh, his biography takes you almost every corner of the world because he has traveled a lot. And I think what makes the biography so raw and so interesting is the way he describes the horrors of slavery, the treatment of Black people, no matter where he goes, the cruelty of man, as well as the hypocrisy of the same men who follow the Christian ideology. His introduction to the religion became the definitive metaphorical mirror that he uses to call out slavery, racism, and the very institution that is run by devils that read the Bible and call themselves children of God. He became quite successful in the end of his trial, he even fought for abolition. The other interesting side of his story is the supposed evidence that he's not really from Africa, but from North Carolina in the United States. So many scholars have wondered if the rumor of his true birthright, his birthplace, invalidates his autobiography. I personally don't think it does because even if you take out the scenes when he was in Africa, you can still have the impact. Um, However, you'll probably lose the deep sympathetic aspect that comes with it when you imagine a little boy violently uprooted from his environment, his home, and forced to quickly grow up in a cruel machine of slavery and witness absolute horror. Let's not forget that Equiano did not know the language or many things outside of his space in Africa, so everything was really a major shock for him. And honestly, you cannot talk about slave narrative, firsthand experience of slavery in literature without talking about Equiano. I read this in an English class, and it focused on race, about how race came about, how it was repackaged and molded through centuries in the real world and applied into text. So to be, how it's recognized now in modern times and why. It's very interesting. I did love that class though. I love every lecture. It was awesome. I read I also like the books. So I read Shakespeare's Othello, I read Benito Cereno, I read Orinoco. I might have to talk about these in another episode, especially Orinoco, because I have a lot to say about that one. But anyways, let me find you a passage that I think is a good introduction to like the story of what you'll expect. This is coming from the Penguin edition. This is page 104. Let's see. While I was thus employed by my master, I was often a witness to cruelties of every kind, which were exercised on my unhappy fellow slaves. I used frequently to have different cargoes of new Negroes in my care for sale, and it was almost all a constant practice with our clerks and other whites to commit violent depredations on the chastity of female slaves, and these I was, though with reluctance, obliged to submit to at all times, being unable to help them. When we had when we have had some of these slaves on board my master's vessels to carry them to other islands or to America, I have known our mates to commit these acts most shamefully, to the disgrace not of Christians only, but of men. I have even known them gratify their brutal passion with females not 10 years old, and these abominations some of them practiced to such scandalous excess that one of our captains discharged the mate and others on that account. And yet, in Montserrat, I have seen a negro man staked to the ground and cut most shockingly, and then his ears cut off bit by bit, because he had been connected with a white woman who was a common prostitute, as if it were no crime in the whites to rob an innocent African girl of her virtue, but most heinous in a black man only to gratify a passion of nature, where the temptation was offered by one of a different color, though the most abandoned woman of her species. So you see, from that passage alone, you can tell this book is full of descriptive encounters of racism, cruelty of man, degradation of the African people by their colonizers who preach their religion but also demoralize themselves in their baseless and godless tendencies. This book didn't really make me cry, but it did put me in his shoes. I imagined how he must have felt as a young boy taken to such hell. To see these people call themselves his masters and tell him of a God that would not approve of what they were doing. And when I think of Christianity, and what it might have meant to slaves at the time, I think it might have been insulting and confusing to have to ask a God that looks like their abusers for salvation, for that God to not give it, and think perhaps it's because they're black or unworthy. Equiano did struggle with religion at first, and understandably so. And then, to me, he seemed to use it, like I said in the beginning, as a lens to view people and their actions. These so-called Christian men were the ones heavily judged through these lens. And I think it was an effective thing because it creates shame, or, a metaphorical mirror in which readers can see the abusers through, in some sense, and perhaps even themselves. I don't know. That's just how I felt.